The morning sun painted the runway in golden streaks as Captain Sarah Martinez adjusted her helmet one final time. At 28, she had already logged over 3,000 flight hours, but today felt different. The mission briefing had been unusually tense, with intelligence reports suggesting heavy enemy activity in the mountain region they were assigned to patrol. Sarah's squadron consisted of 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons, each pilot handpicked for their exceptional skills. As the only female pilot in the unit, Sarah had faced her share of skepticism over the years, but her performance had silenced most doubters. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, had specifically requested her for this mission, knowing her reputation for precision flying in difficult conditions. The target area was a remote valley system in the mountains of Afghanistan, where Taliban forces had reportedly established a new stronghold. Recent satellite imagery showed unusual movement patterns, suggesting the preparation of anti-aircraft installations. The squadron's job was to conduct reconnaissance and, if necessary, neutralize any threats to coalition forces operating in the region. As Sarah ran through her pre-flight checklist, she couldn't shake an uneasy feeling. The weather reports showed clear skies, but mountain conditions could change rapidly. More concerning were the intelligence gaps in their briefing. The enemy's capabilities in this particular area remained largely unknown, and that uncertainty made every pilot nervous. Her aircraft, tail number 847, had been her faithful companion for over 2 years. Every gauge, every switch, every subtle vibration was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. The ground crew had given the plane a thorough inspection, but Sarah performed her own external check anyway. Trust in her equipment was crucial, but verification was survival. The other pilots gathered around their aircraft with similar intensity. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, a veteran with 15 years of service, was checking his navigation systems for the third time. Captain David Chun, the youngest member of their team, reviewed his weapons systems with methodical precision. Each pilot knew that in combat situations, preparation could mean the difference between returning home or not returning at all. Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through the radio system as the pilots completed their preparations. The mission parameters were straightforward on paper. Fly to the designated coordinates, conduct visual and electronic reconnaissance of the valley system, document any military installations or activities, and return to base. If engaged by enemy forces, they were authorized to defend themselves and eliminate threats as necessary. Sarah climbed into her cockpit as the sun climbed higher in the sky. The familiar smell of aviation fuel and the hum of electronic systems welcomed her like an old friend. Her hands moved automatically through the startup sequence, each switch and button pressed with practiced efficiency. The powerful engine roared to life, sending vibrations through the airframe that she felt in her bones. Ground control cleared the squadron for takeoff in formation. Sarah's position was number 3 in the formation, a spot that allowed her to maintain visual contact with the lead aircraft while staying alert for any potential threats. As her aircraft lifted off the runway, she felt the familiar rush of acceleration and the moment when the wheels left solid ground. The flight to the target area would take approximately 45 minutes at cruising altitude. Sarah used this time to review the mission parameters once more and study the terrain maps. The valley system they were approaching was known for its unpredictable wind patterns and narrow passages between towering peaks. Flying in such terrain required constant attention and quick reflexes. As they approached the mountain range, the radio chatter between pilots became more focused and professional. Each pilot reported their status and confirmed their position within the formation. The lead pilot, Major Thompson, updated everyone on the current weather conditions and reminded them to stay alert for any ground-to-air threats. The beauty of the mountain landscape below was striking, but Sarah kept her attention focused on her instruments and the surrounding airspace. Years of training had taught her that the most dangerous moments often came when everything appeared peaceful and routine. Enemy forces were skilled at camouflaging their positions and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Radio communications with their base became intermittent as they flew deeper into the mountainous terrain. The peaks interfered with signal transmission, creating dead zones where the pilots had to rely on their own judgment and training. This isolation from command and control added another layer of complexity to an already challenging mission. As they neared the target valley, Major Thompson signaled for the squadron to reduce altitude and prepare for the reconnaissance phase of their mission. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as they descended into the canyon system. The walls of rock rose high on either side, creating natural corridors that could hide enemy positions or become death traps if they encountered anti-aircraft fire. The first indication of trouble came from Lieutenant Rodriguez, whose electronic warfare systems detected radar signatures that shouldn't have been there. The enemy had installed sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems in positions that weren't marked on their intelligence maps. Before anyone could react, the distinctive streak of a missile launch lit up the valley floor below them. Sarah's training kicked in immediately as warning alarms filled her cockpit. The squadron scattered according to their emergency protocols, each pilot taking evasive action while trying to maintain some semblance of formation. The peaceful morning reconnaissance mission had suddenly become a fight for survival in a valley that had become a carefully prepared trap. Major Thompson's voice cut through the radio static with urgent commands as more missile launches appeared from multiple positions around the valley. The enemy had waited until the entire squadron was committed to the canyon before revealing their true strength. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire from concealed positions, filling the air with deadly projectiles that forced the pilots to fly even lower and faster through the narrow passages. Sarah's aircraft shuddered as fragments from an explosion peppered her fuselage, but her instruments showed no critical damage. Around her, the other pilots fought for their lives while trying to find a way out of the trap that had been set for them. The valley that had looked like a routine patrol area on the mission maps had become a carefully orchestrated ambush designed to destroy their entire squadron. The chaos in the valley intensified as more enemy positions revealed themselves. Captain Chen's aircraft took a direct hit to his left wing, sending him into an uncontrolled spin toward the rocky canyon floor. Sarah watched in horror as her youngest squadron mate fought to regain control of his damaged fighter. His voice came through the radio, strained but determined as he managed to level out just meters above the ground. Major Thompson attempted to lead the squadron toward the valley exit, but enemy forces had anticipated this move. Heavy machine gun fire erupted from positions on both sides of the canyon, creating a deadly crossfire that made escape impossible. The exit route that had seemed so clear on their approach was now completely blocked by concentrated anti-aircraft fire. Sarah's mind raced as she analyzed their desperate situation. The enemy had studied their flight patterns and tactics, positioning their weapons to create an inescapable kill zone. Traditional evasion maneuvers were useless in the confined space of the canyon, where every turn brought them closer to the rocky walls or into the sights of another hidden gun position. Lieutenant Rodriguez reported that his aircraft had sustained damage to his navigation systems, leaving him partially blind in the electronic warfare environment. The enemy was using jamming equipment to disrupt their communications and targeting systems, making coordinated action nearly impossible. Each pilot was essentially fighting alone while trying to maintain some connection with their fellow squadron members. The sound of metal striking metal echoed through Sarah's cockpit as another burst of gunfire found its mark. Her left engine began showing warning indicators, forcing her to adjust her power settings to compensate for the damage. Flying with one engine compromised in such confined terrain would test every skill she had developed over her years of training and combat experience. Captain Chen's situation grew more critical as his damaged wing began losing fuel at an alarming rate. His aircraft was leaving a trail of vapor that made him an easy target for enemy gunners, but he continued to fight alongside his squadron mates despite his deteriorating condition. Sarah could hear the determination in his voice as he called out enemy positions, to help his fellow pilots avoid the worst of the defensive fire. Major Thompson's aircraft suddenly lurched as a surface-to-air missile exploded close enough to damage his flight control systems. His voice over the radio became urgent as he struggled to maintain altitude, while his plane became increasingly difficult to control. The squadron leader who had guided them into the valley was now fighting just to keep his aircraft airborne. Sarah realized that conventional escape routes were no longer viable. The enemy had prepared this trap too well, accounting for standard military tactics and procedures. If the squadron was going to survive, someone would need to think beyond traditional approaches and find a solution that the enemy hadn't anticipated. Her eyes swept across her instruments and then to the canyon walls rising on either side of their position. Years of studying aerodynamics and unconventional flying techniques had given her knowledge that might prove crucial in their current situation. The narrow passages and steep terrain that trapped them might also provide an unexpected escape route for someone willing to take extreme risks. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications as the pilots reported damage and dwindling ammunition. Their fuel supplies were also becoming a concern, as the high-energy maneuvering required to avoid enemy fire consumed aviation fuel at an accelerated rate. Time was running out for the entire squadron, and traditional military solutions were proving inadequate. Sarah's training at the elite test pilot school had included extensive work on extreme flight maneuvers and recovery techniques. She had practiced flying in conditions that other pilots considered impossible, learning to push aircraft beyond their normal performance envelopes. Those skills, which had seemed academic at the time, were now the squadron's only hope for survival. The canyon system extended in multiple directions, creating a maze of passages that could either provide escape routes or lead to dead ends. Sarah began to study the terrain more carefully, looking for features that might allow unconventional flight paths. Her knowledge of aerodynamics told her that under certain conditions, the canyon walls might actually provide lift assistance rather than just obstacles. Enemy fire continued to intensify as more positions opened up along the canyon walls. The defensive network was more extensive than their intelligence had indicated, suggesting that this location had been prepared as a major stronghold rather than the temporary installation they had expected to find. The squadron had flown directly into what amounted to a carefully orchestrated execution. Lieutenant Rodriguez's aircraft began trailing black smoke as his damaged systems started failing one by one. His radio transmissions became intermittent as electrical systems malfunctioned under the stress of combat damage. Sarah could see his aircraft wobbling uncertainly as he fought to maintain formation while dealing with multiple system failures. Major Thompson attempted to coordinate a formation attack on one of the primary gun positions, but the enemy's overlapping fields of fire made such an approach suicidal. Every conventional tactical option seemed to lead directly into concentrated defensive fire that would destroy any aircraft attempting to follow standard procedures. Sarah's mind began formulating a plan that would have seemed impossible under normal circumstances. The narrow canyon passages that trapped them could potentially be used as high-speed escape routes if someone was willing to fly at extremely low altitude while maintaining precise control in turbulent air conditions. The risks were enormous, but their current situation offered no safe alternatives. She began to calculate wind patterns and air pressure differentials within the canyon system. The walls created unique aerodynamic conditions that could either destroy an aircraft or, if properly utilized, provide the lift and maneuverability needed for an unconventional escape. Her background in advanced flight testing had prepared her for exactly this type of analysis. The squadron's ammunition was running dangerously low as the pilots expended their weapons in defensive actions against the overwhelming enemy positions. Return fire had silenced some of the anti-aircraft guns, but new positions continued to reveal themselves as the battle progressed. The enemy had prepared this trap with redundant systems designed to ensure that no aircraft could escape. Captain Shen's fuel situation reached critical levels as his damaged wing continued hemorrhaging aviation fuel. His aircraft's performance was degrading rapidly, making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain formation or execute evasive maneuvers. Sarah realized that if her unconventional plan had any chance of success, it would need to be implemented immediately before the squadron lost more aircraft to damage or fuel starvation. The radio filled with static as enemy jamming systems intensified their efforts to disrupt squadron communications. Sarah knew that once she committed to her plan, the other pilots would need to follow her lead without the benefit of detailed explanations or coordination. Their survival would depend on their ability to trust her judgment and follow her aircraft through maneuvers that violated every standard operating procedure. Sarah keyed her radio and spoke with calm authority that cut through the chaos surrounding the squadron. Her voice carried none of the panic that might have been expected in such a desperate situation, instead projecting the confidence of someone who had found a solution where others saw only death. She told her fellow pilots to form up behind her aircraft and prepare for a maneuver that would either save them all or destroy them in the attempt. Major Thompson's damaged aircraft struggled to maintain position as Sarah took the lead of the formation. His flight controls were becoming increasingly unresponsive, but he managed to communicate his readiness to follow her lead. The other pilots acknowledged her instructions with terse radio calls, their voices betraying the stress of their situation, but showing complete trust in her abilities. Sarah dove her aircraft toward the canyon floor, flying so low that her landing gear nearly scraped the rocky ground. The other pilots followed in tight formation, their aircraft creating a single line of fighters that hugged every contour of the terrain. Enemy gunners had to adjust their aim constantly as the formation disappeared behind rock outcroppings and reappeared in unexpected locations. The key to Sarah's plan lay in exploiting the aerodynamic effects created by the canyon's unique geography. Air flowing over and around the rock formations created updrafts and pressure variations that could provide additional lift if utilized correctly. Flying at such low altitude in these conditions required split-second timing and absolute precision in aircraft control. Her first maneuver took the formation through a narrow side passage that enemy forces hadn't anticipated would be used by military aircraft. The passage was barely wide enough for a single fighter, requiring the pilots to fly in perfect single file while maintaining precise spacing. Any deviation from the planned flight path would result in collision with either the canyon walls or another aircraft. The sound of her engines echoed off the rock walls as Sarah's aircraft shot through the narrow defile at maximum speed. Behind her, the other pilots fought to maintain formation while dealing with the turbulent air conditions created by the confined space. Lieutenant Rodriguez's damaged navigation systems made the maneuver even more challenging, forcing him to rely entirely on visual contact with the aircraft ahead of him. Enemy forces struggled to track the formation as it disappeared into passages too narrow for effective weapons deployment. The anti-aircraft guns that had dominated the main canyon were positioned to cover the obvious escape routes, not the seemingly impossible flight paths that Sarah had chosen. Her unconventional approach was succeeding precisely because it violated every principle of safe military flying. Captain Chen's fuel situation became critical as the high-speed, low-altitude flight consumed his remaining reserves at an alarming rate. His damaged wing was creating additional drag that forced his engines to work harder, accelerating the fuel consumption beyond sustainable levels. Sarah monitored his status while calculating whether her escape route would get them to safety before his aircraft ran out of power. The canyon system opened into a broader valley that provided more maneuvering room, but also exposed the formation to anti-aircraft fire from previously hidden positions. Sarah recognized that the enemy had prepared multiple defensive zones, expecting that any surviving aircraft would eventually be forced into these more open areas where concentrated fire could finish them off. Instead of following the natural flight path through the open valley, Sarah executed a maneuver that took the formation directly up the face of a near-vertical cliff wall. The pilots climbed at maximum power while following the contours of the rock face so closely that their wingtips nearly touched the stone surface. This approach kept them below the minimum elevation angle for most anti-aircraft weapons while using the cliff face as natural cover. The aerodynamic ground effect, created by flying so close to the vertical rock surface, provided additional lift that helped the heavily loaded aircraft climb more efficiently than normal flight conditions would allow. Sarah's extensive knowledge of advanced aerodynamics enabled her to exploit these effects in ways that conventional military training didn't cover, giving the squadron capabilities that their enemies hadn't anticipated. Major Thompson's aircraft began showing signs of structural stress as the damaged flight control systems struggled with the extreme maneuvering requirements. His voice over the radio remained steady despite the obvious difficulty he was experiencing in maintaining formation. Years of military discipline kept him focused on following Sarah's lead rather than dwelling on his aircraft's deteriorating condition. The top of the cliff revealed a narrow ridge system that connected to the main mountain range beyond the valley complex. Sarah guided the formation along this ridge at extremely low altitude, using the natural terrain to mask their approach from enemy radar systems. Flying between mountain peaks required constant attention to wind conditions and altitude changes that could prove fatal in such confined terrain. Enemy communications intercepted by Lieutenant Rodriguez's electronic warfare systems revealed increasing confusion and frustration among the defensive forces. The squadron's unconventional escape route had completely disrupted their planned ambush, leaving gun crews unable to effectively target aircraft that appeared and disappeared unpredictably among the rock formations. Sarah's plan required one more critical maneuver to get the squadron completely clear of the enemy defensive network. A gap between two mountain peaks offered a potential escape route, but reaching it would require flying through a narrow pass where enemy forces might have positioned additional weapons. The intelligence reports had been incomplete about defensive installations in this particular area. She led the formation through a series of S-turns that followed the natural contours of the mountainside, while gradually gaining altitude toward the gap between peaks. The maneuver required each pilot to maintain perfect formation spacing while executing turns that brought them within meters of solid rock. One mistake in timing or aircraft control would destroy multiple aircraft in the resulting collision. Captain Chen's aircraft began to lag behind as his fuel reserves reached emergency levels. The damage to his wing had created fuel leaks that couldn't be stopped, and his engines were now running on vapors rather than adequate fuel supplies. Sarah adjusted her flight plan to account for his deteriorating situation while maintaining the formation's progress toward safety. The gap between mountains loomed ahead, but enemy muzzle flashes indicated that anti-aircraft positions were indeed covering this potential escape route. Sarah realized that reaching safety would require one final demonstration of flying skills that pushed both aircraft and pilots beyond their normal operational limits. The enemy's last line of defense would need to be overcome through sheer audacity and precision flying. Her aircraft entered the mountain pass with all engines at maximum power, followed by 5 other fighters in tight formation. Enemy tracers lit up the air around them as anti-aircraft guns opened fire from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow passage. The pilots flew straight through the concentrated fire, trusting in speed and surprise to carry them past the deadly defensive positions. The formation burst through the mountain pass and into clear airspace beyond the enemy defensive network. Sarah's unconventional escape plan had succeeded against overwhelming odds, saving a squadron that had been marked for destruction by a carefully planned enemy ambush. Her knowledge of advanced aerodynamics and willingness to attempt maneuvers that other pilots considered impossible had turned certain death into miraculous survival. The clear airspace beyond the mountain pass felt like paradise after the deadly confines of the enemy ambush zone. But Sarah knew their ordeal was far from over. Captain Chen's aircraft was running on fumes, and Major Thompson's damaged flight controls were becoming increasingly unreliable with each passing minute. Getting the squadron safely back to base would require careful fuel management and continued vigilance for additional enemy threats. Sarah established communication with their home base, reporting the squadron's survival and requesting immediate medical and maintenance support upon their return. The radio operator's voice betrayed surprise and relief at hearing from pilots who had been presumed lost when their scheduled radio check-in time had passed without contact. The failed mission had been transformed into a survival story that would be studied by military aviators for years to come. Captain Chin's fuel gauge showed empty, but his engines continued running on whatever vapors remained in his tanks and fuel lines. Sarah calculated the distance to their base and realized that his aircraft would likely experience engine failure before reaching the runway. Emergency procedures would need to be implemented to ensure his safe recovery, even if it meant sacrificing his expensive fighter aircraft. The formation adjusted course for the most direct route home, abandoning the planned return flight path in favor of saving every possible minute of flight time. Sarah coordinated with air traffic control to clear all other aircraft from their approach corridor and to have emergency vehicles standing by for multiple aircraft with varying degrees of battle damage and system failures. Major Thompson's situation deteriorated as his flight control problems worsened, making it increasingly difficult to maintain formation or execute precise maneuvers. Sarah assigned Lieutenant Rodriguez to fly close formation with the Major, ready to provide guidance and assistance if his aircraft became completely uncontrollable. The squadron that had entered combat as individual fighters was now functioning as a coordinated rescue operation. The landscape below them gradually changed from mountainous terrain to the flatter desert approaches to their airbase. Each mile covered brought them closer to safety, but also closer to the moment when fuel exhaustion would force difficult decisions about aircraft and pilot survival. Sarah monitored every system in her own aircraft while keeping track of her squadron mate's deteriorating conditions. Emergency vehicles were already moving into position on the runway as the control tower received updates on the squadron's approach. Crash trucks, ambulances, and maintenance crews prepared for what could become a complex recovery operation involving multiple aircraft with different emergency conditions. The base commander himself took position in the control tower to monitor the situation. Captain Chin's voice remained steady over the radio as he reported his fuel situation and prepared for the possibility of engine failure during the approach to landing. His training in emergency procedures was now being tested under real-world conditions where textbook solutions might not be sufficient to ensure survival. Sarah coordinated with him to plan for various contingencies, depending on when his engines finally quit. The first sign of engine trouble came as a reduction in power from Chin's damaged aircraft, forcing him to begin a gradual descent toward the desert floor. Sarah immediately adjusted the formation's approach plan to accommodate his emergency situation while ensuring that the other aircraft could still reach the runway safely. Splitting the formation would complicate the recovery operation, but might be necessary to save all lives involved. Major Thompson volunteered to accompany Captain Shun during his emergency approach, despite his own aircraft's control problems. The military tradition of never abandoning a fellow pilot in distress overrode concerns about his own safety, demonstrating the bond that existed between squadron members who had survived combat together. Sarah found herself making command decisions that would normally be the responsibility of higher-ranking officers, but the immediate situation required decisive action from whoever had the clearest understanding of each aircraft's capabilities and limitations. Her successful leadership during the escape from the enemy ambush had established her authority within the squadron regardless of formal rank structures. The air base appeared on the horizon as a welcome sight for pilots who had faced death in the mountain valleys. Control tower personnel confirmed that all emergency services were ready and that the runway had been cleared for immediate recovery operations. The base's rescue helicopters were also airborne and ready to respond if any aircraft went down short of the runway. Captain Chin's engines finally quit when the formation was still 15 miles from the runway, forcing him to begin an unpowered glide toward the desert below. His emergency training took over as he configured his aircraft for maximum gliding distance, while searching for the flattest available terrain for an emergency landing. Sarah coordinated with rescue helicopters to mark his position and prepare for immediate recovery operations. The young pilot's calm professionalism during his emergency descent impressed everyone monitoring the radio communications. Despite facing a potentially fatal aircraft accident, he continued to provide updates on his situation while following emergency procedures with textbook precision. His aircraft descended steadily toward the desert floor, while rescue units tracked his position and prepared for immediate response. Sarah made the difficult decision to continue toward the base with the remaining aircraft rather than circle over Chen's crash site. Major Thompson's deteriorating flight controls meant that any delay could result in additional emergencies, and the squadron's survival depended on getting everyone safely on the ground as quickly as possible. Rescue helicopters would handle Chen's recovery while she focused on the remaining pilots. The control tower cleared the squadron for immediate landing on the main runway, while emergency vehicles moved into position along the flight path. Sarah's aircraft still showed damage from the enemy gunfire, but her systems remained functional enough for a normal landing approach. Lieutenant Rodriguez and the other surviving pilots reported similar situations with minor damage, but no critical system failures. Major Thompson's approach became increasingly unstable as his flight control problems reached critical levels. Sarah talked him through each phase of the landing procedure, while emergency crews prepared for a possible runway crash that could close the airfield for hours. His aircraft weaved uncertainly as it descended toward the runway threshold, but his experience and determination kept it under marginal control. The first touchdown belonged to Sarah's aircraft, which rolled smoothly down the runway, despite the visible damage to its fuselage and wings. Emergency crews examined the aircraft for fuel leaks or other hazards while she completed her shutdown procedures and prepared to assist with the recovery of her squadron mates. Her successful leadership had brought most of the squadron home against impossible odds. Lieutenant Rodriguez landed without incident, his damaged navigation systems having held together long enough to complete the mission recovery. The other pilots followed in sequence, each aircraft showing varying degrees of battle damage, but all reaching the runway safely. The squadron that had been ambushed and trapped in enemy territory was now safely back on friendly soil. Major Thompson's landing approach continued to deteriorate as his aircraft became increasingly difficult to control. Sarah watched from the ground as his fighter weaved back and forth across the runway centerline, but somehow managed to touch down within the runway boundaries. Emergency crews surrounded his aircraft immediately as he brought it to a stop, ending the most challenging flight of his military career. News of Captain Chen's successful emergency landing reached the base just as the last aircraft was being secured by ground crews. The rescue helicopters had located his crash site and confirmed that he had survived the desert landing with only minor injuries. His aircraft was a total loss, but the pilot who had shown such courage during the combat engagement was safe and would fly again. The debriefing session began 3 hours after the last aircraft had been secured, giving the pilots time to decompress from their harrowing experience while intelligence officers prepared detailed questions about the enemy ambush. Sarah found herself at the center of attention as commanders sought to understand how her unconventional flying had saved a squadron that should have been completely destroyed by the carefully planned enemy trap. Colonel Harrison listened intently as Sarah explained her analysis of the aerodynamic conditions within the canyon system and how she had recognized the potential for using terrain features as aids rather than obstacles. Her background in advanced flight testing had provided knowledge that proved crucial when conventional military tactics failed to offer viable escape options. The intelligence failure that had led to the ambush became apparent as the pilots described the extensive enemy defensive network they had encountered. The valley system had been transformed into a sophisticated kill zone with overlapping fields of fire and redundant weapon systems designed to ensure that no aircraft could escape once they entered the trap. Major Thompson provided details about the enemy's tactical approach, noting how they had waited until the entire squadron was committed to the canyon before revealing their true strength. The patience and discipline shown by the enemy forces indicated a level of military sophistication that had been underestimated by intelligence analysts. Captain Chin's account of his emergency landing added another dimension to the squadron's survival story, demonstrating how individual courage and training had complemented Sarah's innovative leadership. His calm professionalism during the fuel emergency had prevented panic within the formation while enabling the other pilots to focus on their own survival challenges. The investigation into the intelligence failure revealed that enemy forces had used deception techniques to conceal the true nature of their installations in the valley system. False radio transmissions and carefully positioned decoy equipment had led analysts to underestimate both the scope and sophistication of the defensive network that the squadron had encountered. Sarah's personnel file was updated to reflect her exceptional performance during the crisis, but she remained focused on the lessons learned rather than personal recognition. Her analysis of the mission identified several areas where improved training and equipment modifications could better prepare pilots for similar situations in the future. The tactical innovations that Sarah had employed during the escape were studied by flight instructors and incorporated into advanced training curricula at military aviation schools. Her willingness to attempt maneuvers that violated standard operating procedures had revealed new possibilities for aircraft employment in extreme situations. Medical examinations confirmed that all pilots had survived their ordeal without serious physical injuries, though the psychological impact of facing near-certain death would require ongoing support and counseling. The squadron members had developed an even stronger bond through their shared experience of survival against overwhelming odds. Aircraft maintenance crews worked around the clock to assess and repair the battle damage sustained by the surviving fighters. The extent of the damage provided valuable information about enemy weapons capabilities while demonstrating the remarkable resilience of modern military aircraft when operated by skilled pilots under extreme conditions. Captain Chin's destroyed aircraft was recovered from the desert crash site and transported back to the base for detailed analysis. Investigators hoped to learn more about the enemy's anti-aircraft weapons by studying the damage patterns, while engineers examined the wreckage for insights that might improve aircraft survivability in future conflicts. The enemy's reaction to the squadron's escape was monitored through electronic intelligence gathering, revealing frustration and confusion among their forces. The carefully planned ambush had failed to achieve its objectives, and the survivors' detailed knowledge of defensive positions would compromise future enemy operations in the region. Sarah's innovative flying techniques were classified and incorporated into special operations training programs where such unconventional approaches might prove valuable. Her ability to think beyond traditional tactical limitations had opened new possibilities for military aviation that warranted further development and refinement. Awards and commendations were processed for all squadron members, recognizing their courage and professionalism during the combat engagement. Sarah's leadership during the crisis earned her promotion consideration and assignment to advanced tactical development programs where her skills could benefit the broader military aviation community. The mission's failure to complete its original reconnaissance objectives was overshadowed by the intelligence value gained from direct contact with sophisticated enemy defensive systems. The squadron survival had provided detailed information about enemy capabilities that would prove valuable in planning future operations against similar targets. Training modifications were implemented throughout the Air Force based on lessons learned from the squadron's experience. Emphasis was placed on creative problem-solving and unconventional approaches to tactical challenges, recognizing that future conflicts might require thinking beyond established doctrines and procedures. Sarah's reputation within the military aviation community was transformed from that of a skilled but relatively unknown pilot to a recognized expert in extreme flight situations. Her willingness to share knowledge and train other pilots ensured that her innovations would benefit the entire aviation community rather than remaining isolated individual achievements. The squadron was reconstituted with replacement aircraft and additional pilots, but The core group that had survived the ambush remained together as a highly experienced unit. Their shared understanding of extreme combat conditions made them particularly valuable for future high-risk missions where conventional approaches might prove inadequate. Years later, aviation historians would study the mission as an example of how individual innovation and courage could overcome overwhelming tactical disadvantages. Sarah's flying techniques were preserved in training archives and continued to influence pilot development long after her active service career had ended. The valley system where the ambush had occurred was eventually neutralized by follow-up operations that used the intelligence gathered during the squadron survival ordeal. Sarah's detailed knowledge of the terrain and enemy positions proved instrumental in planning the successful destruction of the defensive network that had nearly claimed their lives. The true measure of Sarah's achievement lay not in the awards and recognition she received, but in the lives saved and the knowledge gained through her innovative approach to an impossible situation. Her willingness to risk everything on unconventional flying techniques had transformed certain death into miraculous survival, earning her a permanent place in military aviation history. The squadron story became part of the curriculum at military academies worldwide, where future officers studied the importance of creative thinking and individual initiative in crisis situations. Sarah's example demonstrated that true leadership often required the courage to abandon established procedures when survival demanded innovative solutions. Her legacy extended beyond the immediate military community, as civilian aviation also benefited from the aerodynamic principles she had applied during the rescue operation. Test pilots and aerospace engineers studied her techniques for potential applications in both military and civilian aircraft development, ensuring that her innovations would continue to save lives in various aviation contexts. The bonds forged between squadron members during their shared ordeal lasted throughout their careers and beyond. They remained in contact long after their military service ended, united by the memory of the day when one pilot's extraordinary skills and courage had saved them all from certain death in an enemy ambush that should have left no survivors.